Here we're going to have a look at different ecosystems, and we're not going to spend all our time looking at individual ecosystems. What we're going to have a look at is how we describe ecosystems. And this is kind of important because, in maths, you don't learn, a mathematician doesn't learn every single multiplication, it doesn't learn every single addition. What a mathematician will do is he'll learn rules that can be applied to different numbers. And it's the same sort of concept here. You need to understand what is meant by a biotic and an abiotic factor in order to describe an ecosystem. So if we have a quick look through some of this stuff. So this is one of my son's favourite movies. It's Zootopia. And I love watching Zootopia because it is a city that is basically differentiated into these different ecosystems for different types of animals, and they all live together. And you've got sort of the savanna, you've got the Sahara, you've got the tundra, you've got rainforest zones. And each of those would be a different ecosystem. So different animals will live in different areas. So those animals and those plants that you find in those different ecosystems, they are what you'd call your biotic factors, right? Your abiotic factors would be the temperature. Now, this is the bit that always kind of annoys me a bit about Zootopia, because you've got your Sahara next to your tundra. And this is generally quite cold, and this is going to be very hot. So why the heat energy doesn't go like half a mile north and heat up the tundra is beyond me. But we sort of, treat it as a cartoon and a little bit of fun. But the temperature, the rainfall, all these things would be what you'd class as your abiotic factors. So they're the things that aren't living. So we could do a whole list of these, but biotic factors tend to be stuff like predator-prey relationships. You tend to have things like the microorganisms, so diseases and those sorts of things. You tend to have any sort of, it's all about the relationships between the organisms, so the plant life, the fauna, the flora, fauna being animals, flora being plants, and all those sorts of things tie into the biotic factors. So you talk about the biodiversity, which is another lesson altogether, but that's how varied the life that is there is. The abiotic factors will be things like temperature, and that's come out of it. There we go. So temperature, rainfall, oxygen availability, all these sorts of factors that are more sort of associated with weather. Okay, nutrients is another one. So you find that things like the rainforest are actually very low in nutrition, because most of that nutrients from any living organism that dies get absorbed straight away into the plants. So the soil is actually quite low in nutrition. So these are sort of abiotic factors, and which ones you use depends on the ecosystem. So for example, we wouldn't talk about rainfall if we were talking about the ocean, because the rainfall is not going to affect the organisms in the water. Okay, so these sort of things to think about. So let's just have a look at an example. So this is a picture of a British countryside, and I've got sort of 3 different ecosystems here, but we're going to sort of lump a couple of them together. So this is what you would call a temperate woodland. You tend to have, if this was natural, which it isn't, this would be filled with all sorts of trees like yew and ash and those sorts of things. You'd also have grasses there. You would have animals such as rabbits, foxes. In fact, we should have bears and all sorts of other things like wolves in there, but they've gone extinct in the UK hundreds of years ago. So those would be my biotic factors. My abiotic factors would be a temperate climate, so that's sort of between tropical and sort of Arctic temperatures, so very hot and very cold, nice, comfortable. Rainfall would be sort of pretty consistent, actually, not particularly high, but consistent throughout the year. Temperature would go through seasons, so you would have very hot seasons, quite cold seasons, but never get very hot and they'd never get very cold. Nutrition tends to be reasonably high as well. But then we also have this ecosystem here, and this ecosystem would be the river. Now, because it's a fast-moving river, it's generally quite high in oxygen, as opposed to an ocean, which would be quite low in oxygen relative to a river. You have sort of life, so you might have some fish in there, some types of fish. You will probably have some sort of bottom feeds, shrimp, some slugworms, those sorts of things in there as well. And you probably can imagine some of the animals that go into that you find in a river. Temperature, it's in sort of a temperate zone. Again, they would be sort of medium. It wouldn't be too hot, wouldn't be too cold. You also look at things like salinity, which is how salty it is. Now, because it's a river, it wouldn't be salty at all. And you'd also look at things like pH, and again, in a river, it'd be slightly acidic because it's come from mostly rainwater. However, that might be neutralised by the ground, so it might be near neutral. So these are just some of the sort of factors you would use to describe an ecosystem.